Welcome to EDU 6950, and our course, of course, is integrating multimedia in the content areas. And the idea that we've been discussing has been mastery learning. Well, for today's topic, we want to think about how do I implement mastery learning. That's a big thing. I mean, we've talked about what it is, but now what do I do to make it work? Well, the first thing I've got to stop and think about, I've got to think about my course. What are the things that we're trying to accomplish in the course? Well, let's see. I want to think about what are some multimedia resources that we're going to be using, or what is multimedia learning, or let's see, what is mastery learning? That's something that's important. How about like today's topic, how do I implement mastery learning, or how do I put all this into creating a unit of study? Well, that's great. It's just kind of jumbled around, and fortunately I put numbers next to them so I know what I'm going to do next. The next thing I need to do is think, what has to come first? What comes second? What comes third? Well, if I'm going to be doing mastery learning, I think I want to make sure that mastery learning comes first. What is mastery learning? And then I think, well, if I'm going to be talking about that, I've got to stop and think, okay, now how do I implement mastery learning? All right, well, I've got implementation. If I'm doing implementation, now I've got to think about what is multimedia learning, because in this course we're talking about using multimedia learning to support this. So that's the next thing. And of course, I'm going to talk about what is multimedia learning. I need to know what are some of those resources that I'm going to be using. And then ultimately, how do I put all this together into a unit of study? So each of these pieces become individual units or plans for what I want to accomplish. Well, I'm not going to focus on all of this today. I want to think about number 2, how do I implement mastery learning? Well, the first thing I've got to do is when I think about, no, let's go back. No, I'm not going to do that one. Let's go back and do what is mastery learning. That's what I want to use. Let's go with what is mastery learning. If I'm going to do what is mastery learning, I've got to stop and think, well, what is it the student needs to know in order to answer this question? All right, so let's see. I've got to think about my objectives. I want them to know the definition of mastery learning. I want the students to understand what are the elements involved that make up mastery learning. What are some of the pros? What are some of the cons? I want the students to be thinking about biblical perspectives of mastery learning. How does this fit with what I do? Well, once I have the objectives, I know that I want the students to be able to state a definition or describe or implement one of these things. I've got to stop and say, now, how in the world am I going to assess these? How am I going to assess these? Don't you like the way those are cut and put together? So with the assessment, how do I know if the student gets it? How do I know if they've got the definition? How do I know if they've got a biblical perspective? So the assessment is important to that. That comes right after my objectives. And of course, this gets into the idea of what is mastery. Do they get it? What is mastery? Well, after I think about that, I've got to stop and say, what are my plans for instruction? I know my objectives because we just talked about those a moment ago. My objectives, of course, let's see, let me get those objectives. My objectives, of course, were definitions, elements, pros, cons, biblical perspectives. So I know my objectives, but what strategies can I use? How can I go about getting this across to my students? Notice, I haven't started writing lesson plans yet. I'm still thinking, I'm still brainstorming, I'm still writing down ideas. Well, maybe I can use a guest lecturer to come in to talk about it. Or maybe I can use some videos, something to get that across to the students. Or maybe I want to go with inquiry-based learning, where I set up a problem and make them go look after it. Or again, like problem-based learning, do something similar to that. I can use small groups maybe. Or how about jigsaw? That was what we did yesterday when I assigned each of you an element and you had to come together as a group to get the whole puzzle. And then I could use cooperative learning. So I've got my objectives. I'm thinking about my strategies. I'm thinking about how those go together. Now what do I do? Well, next thing I've got to come up with, what about possible technologies that I can use to support what it is I'm trying to accomplish? All right, well, since that's part of the class, I guess that's important. We should talk about that. I mean, I might be able to use some podcasting, or, as you saw last night, vodcasting. I might look at maybe Google Docs. How can I put that together? Or can I Skype somebody to bring them in, a professional that knows this topic, that they can talk to the kids they know? Or how about blogging? I can use blogging, or maybe I can do some video, or there's a popular one, online resources. Maybe I'll hook that up into my PowerPoint and have some hot links for them. Maybe I'll do some iChatting. Now, whatever it is I'm going to do, I'm starting to brainstorm one of many possible technologies that I'm going to use to support reaching those strategies and objectives. Okay, so I've got my technologies thought through. What in the world do I do next? Well, the very next thing I want to do, I want to think about these three areas. I want to think about initiating activities, I want to think about guided learning, and I want to think about culminating performances. So let's cover this up a little bit. And now the first thing. With initiating activities, I've got to stop and think, what's my hook? What's going to draw the students in? What can I do to connect what they already know to what it is that we're about to do? That's important. How about next? Guided learning. Guided learning is the idea of what do I need to teach? How do I want to teach it? Do I want to use direct instruction? Do I want to use indirect instruction? Am I going to pre-record this so they can listen to it at home? You know, what is it I'm going to do to guide them in learning those objectives that I was talking about a few moments ago? Well, then the final thing is the culminating performance. What are the big projects? Maybe I'm going to do role-playing or drama of some kind. Maybe I'm going to do a test. That's nothing wrong with doing tests. Now I'll do a test as the culminating performance. Some way that they have to demonstrate that they've got that. So if we put all these together, after we've done the possible technologies, now we're thinking, well, let's see. Remember the possible technologies? Now that we've done that, now we're going into these ideas. This is starting to be more serious in my approach to my planning. All right, so I'm starting to write all this down. I'm starting to talk to my friends. I'm starting to think what I did last year. I'm starting to think about this group and the dynamics of this group. How are they different? What best reaches to them? What is their interest? How can I involve the interest in doing these kinds of things? Well, the model that I just showed you comes from Recesso and Orrell's book, Integrating Technology into Teaching. And they're put out by Houghton Mifflin. And this is a drawing of one of their tables that they put out. And I like this. And basically, here's what you've got. You're developing a learning unit. If I'm going to design my instruction, I've got to stop and think first, what are my objectives? What is it they need to know? What is it that I've got to teach them? And then after I do that, again, I start thinking about those instructional strategies. What am I going to use? Now, am I going to use cooperative learning? Am I going to use Jigsaw? Remember some of those things we were talking about? Am I going to use those things? And then what about the possible technologies? Am I going to do iChat or something else to help get them across this information? And then, of course, the assessment. Now, in their model, they put assessment right over here. But as I was talking about before, it's probably best to have it over here right after objectives. Because if I know what my objective is going to be, the next thing I've got to think is how are they going to demonstrate that? They know that. And these, in that order, will help determine what I do with these next items. You don't have to do it that way, but that's what I recommend. Now over here on the side, we've got learning continuum. And there's that learning continuum of what am I going to do to initiate the activity? What is the hook? What is the thing to connect with something that they already know? And I always have to remember that the kids that come into my classroom don't come from an equal playing field. None of them, they don't always have the same experiences. And so I've got to remember that as I'm planning. I can't take that for granted. I can't assume. I have to learn that by my conversations with my students. And there we go back to relationships as we were talking about yesterday. Then I'm getting into the guided learning. That was the direct instruction, indirect instruction. What is my plan? What am I going to do to teach these objectives? And by the way, remember, these are not just activities. These are lessons. These are things that are going to guide them into learning objectives. An activity can be done, but that's not the instruction. The instruction of the content is something else. Well, then of course we've got our culminating performance. How am I going to assess it? How am I going to show that they've got the mastery? Or how are they going to show it actually? So we put these together and then we come into this box right here, learner-centered activities and technology integration. Now this in brainstorming is just to think about this and think about this and what can I do here that involves technology that has a learner focus. If I'm thinking about initiating or hooking my students in, a picture, a visual, a song, an image, a news headline, a problem that seems insurmountable, whatever it may be, those are the kinds of things I'm starting to brainstorm and write into this section. So when I take all of these and I've got them down on paper, now I can start to formulate step by step in my unit. I can formulate my lessons because I know, okay, if I've got these various objectives for the lesson, What comes first? Lesson number 1. What comes second? Lesson number 2. And all of those go together to form a unit, and also I can use that whole idea of mastery learning in doing this topic.